Legend Total War here, and today we're doing another tier list using Tier Maker, this time covering every single race in Total War Warhammer 3 based on how much of a threat they are to the player when they're controlled by the AI. But before we get into the tier list itself, I do need to let you guys know that this video here is sponsored by Manscaped. So Manscaped has been a big supporter of the channel now for quite a few years, and I absolutely love their products. But the one that I love the most is definitely the Lawnmower 4.0, because this is the best razor I've ever had. It's such a good razor that I can get through a shave as quickly as I can, and I have no chance of nicking myself, which in other electric razors, I've definitely either pinched myself or done a bit of a nick. Because, let's be real, I don't really like to spend loads and loads of time making myself look pretty. I just want to get it done quickly. In fact, the Lawnmower 4.0 is so good that I gave myself a buzz cut with it, and it was just super easy to do. And in fact, it's so good that now my wife has a Lawnmower 4.0 of her own for, her needs. So if you're in the market for a good electric razor, you really can't go wrong with Manscaped. Check out the Platinum Package 4.0, link in the description, and get 20% off with free international shipping plus 2 free gifts of Slaanesh. Big thanks to Manscaped for supporting this video. So on to the actual tier list itself, and before we start putting anyone anywhere, it's really important to quantify what exactly counts as being extremely dangerous or no challenge at all, and get an idea of why I'm putting things where they're going to be. So these are the factions up here that are typically speaking difficult to eliminate, whether their territory is difficult to hold on to, it's difficult to actually conquer them, whether their factional abilities when controlled by the AI cause the player a lot of grief, and whether their armies are actually difficult to deal with in the early, mid, and late game campaigns. How likely these factions here are to eliminate the player if, you're not good enough to be able to handle them. And the factions down here are the ones that are easy to eliminate, tend not to grow very quickly, easy to beat on the battlefield, don't particularly have good AI control over their abilities, that kind of stuff. And then we just, everything in between. Alright, so we're going to be doing the Warhammer 3 races first, then Warhammer 2, and then Warhammer 1. And of course, this is based on a subjective opinion. I think that doesn't really need to be said, but I'll say it anyway. It's based on what I've experienced playing Total Warhammer 3, based on Immortal Empires. And of course, each of these is based on the race, not each individual faction. Because I don't think that that's that much difference between each particular faction. I'd rather cover this on a race-by-race basis. Alright, now, starting with the Demons of Chaos. So there's only one faction that counts as a Demon of Chaos faction. That's, of course, Damn Daniel up in the north. And I would say that he is moderately tough. Like, he's got a good roster. He's up in the Chaos Waste, so unless you're a faction that finds that area easy to occupy, it might take you a little while to occupy him, all of his territory. But typically speaking, he doesn't become super powerful. Also, another thing to consider as well, I'm not taking endgame crisis into consideration, because since a lot of these races don't even have an endgame crisis associated. So obviously, if you're playing with an endgame crisis faction active, it's going to be like a multiplier on top of that. So just keep that in mind. But yeah, these guys here, they're like just moderately tough. They're not super difficult to get rid of. They can put up a good fight, but his location makes him relatively safe as the AI. And they've got Slaanesh. So, Nakari specifically is the only legendary lord in Slaanesh. There are other Slaaneshi factions around, mostly in the northern and southern Chaos Wastes. Typically, I would say that they are probably weak. In terms of AI, I never really see them cause that much of a problems. Even when you're playing as the High Elves, very, very rarely will Nakari gain a really good foothold in Ulthuan, and usually he just gets triple teamed by Tyrion, Eltharion, and Alariel. So oftentimes he's actually one of the first AI players to get wiped out by the AI. Now, the faction itself isn't necessarily weak, but in terms of how much trouble this faction is going to cause you as the player, even if you're playing as the High Elves, I've never really seen Nakari cause that much of a problem. He's definitely not no challenge whatsoever, but if you team up with the other High Elves, you're usually sort of dealing with him without too much of a headache. He's kind of like your first challenge. Unless, of course, you're not actually in Ulthuan. And if you don't start near Ulthuan, typically speaking, by the time you can bother to go to Ulthuan, he hasn't expanded that far. Like, sometimes he'll go into Yvresse, but It's doesn't usually get much further than that. Sometimes he'll ally with Marathi, but whatever. So I usually find him to be fairly weak. In terms of Kugath, or just Nurgle in general, there are, of course, other Nurglish factions in northern and southern Chaos Wastes. I consider them to be no challenge whatsoever. These guys specifically are based on their army. I find them to be one of the easiest armies to defeat in the game, period, regardless of who I'm going up against them with. I've never seen the AI really gain a foothold as Kugath. He's usually completely stuck on the Dragon Isles, and has a massive problem trying to get out of there due to Helm Gorst. And when I arrived there, the biggest concern when dealing with Kugath Plaguefather is the plagues. That is a minor inconvenience, usually, unless you're suffering huge amounts of attrition. But typically speaking, his armies are very easy to deal with, so I would put Nurgle as no challenge to the player whatsoever. And then we've got Tzeentch. Now, this is an interesting one, because I would say that when the player's in command of Tzeentch, it's not really a top-tier faction. It's strong, but it's not super strong. The start position really hurts them quite a bit. But if you, as the player, go up against Tzeentch, this is one of the most dangerous factions that you can go up against. Their armies are incredibly powerful to deal with and super annoying with their army abilities and spellcasting. Very super irritating to just deal with them on the battlefield. But most annoying is the changing of the ways, because it has a huge anti-player bias. Now, some of the other minor Tzeentchian factions, which are pretty much all in the Southern Chaos Wastes, the minor ones usually don't use that many of the changing of the ways, but they definitely do use them. And these are some of the most irritating abilities in the game, especially the one that just halts your entire faction for a single turn. Because there's such a huge anti-player bias with this, he'll pretty much always use it on you. Not to mention he'll switch your settlements around with other people and just give you an absolute headache. So typically speaking, with Tzeentch, the general rule of thumb is, if you start near him, wipe him out straight away. If you don't start near him, pray that Oxyotl wipes him out, or the moment that you meet him, send everything that you've got to take him out, or try to be his friend. No middle ground with him. You either be best buddies or worst enemies. Get rid of Tzeentch as soon as possible, because you will grow to loathe having your settlements switched out and having your faction halted every 8, 9, 10 turns, however often he's going to do it. But yeah, an extremely dangerous faction that can completely derail a iffy campaign. Then we've got Khorne. Now, I'd say that Khorne in the command of the player is one of the strongest factions in the game, but in the command of the AI, they don't really make very good use of their factional abilities, so I'd actually only put him as moderately tough. He usually doesn't get out of his start area, and while his armies can be tough, they tend not to come too numerous, and his garrisons are pathetically weak. Skarbrand himself is obviously a big threat. The minor Khorne factions are not a threat whatsoever, really. They're very easy to take out, and they don't really do anything. But Skarbrand himself, as a legendary lord, can be quite difficult. But his armies are usually, at least at the beginning of the stage of the campaign, usually just filled with melee infantry, which is one of the easiest infantry types to sort of get rid of, even though he does have very good melee infantry. So, don't underestimate him, but also he's not the end game crisis of the game, really, so you should be fine. Even with factions that start off near him, I've never really had too much of a headache with Skarbrand. Then we've got Kislev. So there are 3 Kislev factions, and I would say that all 3 of them put up a weak challenge to the player. Because typically speaking, Boris will get wiped out very early on by Archaon. So unless you're playing as Archaon or the Demon Prince, you're probably not even going to encounter Boris. Tsarina Katerin is usually beset on all sides, so she rarely does anything. And same sort of thing with Kastaltin. So it's not that their faction is weak, it's that they're surrounded and constantly beset by other enemies. So it's usually pretty easy to get in and attack them while they're distracted, and they're usually too distracted to bother sending too many armies at you. And, their armies can be a bit of a headache, which is why I didn't put them at no challenge, but I don't think that they're that much of a challenge for the player. Very rarely will you see these even get out of their start zone. Okay, then we've got the Cathayan factions, 2 legendary lords in there, and I would also put them as weak. Not that the faction is weak, I want to point that out. The factions aren't necessarily, but these guys tend not to cause the player too much of a headache. They usually don't leave Cathay. They're usually stuck in that area due to all the enemies that they have internally there, such as Skaven, Lockyer, Felhard, the Nakai, Greenskins, Ogres, and of course Warriors of Chaos coming in from the north. So if you start in Cathay, like if you're playing as one of those ones I just mentioned, Cathay is usually quite distracted, and their early game armies are usually fairly easy to beat. Their late game armies can be fairly tough, and of course the Legendary Lords can be quite difficult. But overall, I don't really consider them to be much of a threat to the player whatsoever, especially if you're far away from them. You're never going to be thinking to yourself, oh, I hope I don't encounter the Cathay. In fact, usually I'm hoping to encounter a Cathayan caravan to make heaps of money, and I don't usually even worry about diplomatic relations with them, because they're usually just a complete bitch. I just putty in my hand, I just manipulate them however I see fit, regardless of which faction I'm playing as. Okay, then we've got the Ogres. They're also kind of weak in terms of how much threat that they provide to the player. Now this is, I want to point out as well, this is based on Immortal Empires, not Realms of Chaos. Like, all the Warhammer 3 races, especially Legendary Lords, get massive cheats on Realms of Chaos. But in Immortal Empires, I don't really feel like Greasus or Scrag ever really does anything particularly threatening. I find that their armies are not that tough, especially in the early game. If they ever get to late stage armies and start getting Stonehorns, then yes, they do get quite tough. But it takes a long time for that to get rolling, and unless you... Yeah, I just don't see them ever really giving the player that much of a threat. Like, the only way that they could really cause you a headache is if you start in that area and then you just don't deal with them at all and just wait 200 turns, which... that's kind of a weak play, but typically speaking, they're pretty easy to get rid of, fairly early on, I think. Okay, so then we're moving on to Warhammer 2 races. We got the High Elves. Now, in Warhammer 2, the High Elves were one of the most powerful AI races, because Tyrion would just unite the High Elves right away and just snowball out of control. But that doesn't happen in Warhammer 3. He doesn't unite with the other High Elves. I'm pretty sure Legendary Lords just do not confederate unless they're Greenskins, or have the tribal confederation by smashing the other person. High Elves don't do that, and so they don't tend to confederate, so they don't tend to snowball. They usually, as the AI, get stuck fighting Nakari for quite a while, so they're only really that much of a threat if you're playing as Nakari. But that being said, your early game as Nakari, they're not that tough to deal with. So I would say that these guys here, probably moderately tough, but I've never really seen them be that much of a headache in any of my campaigns. So that's where they're going to go there. They don't snowball out of control like they did in Warhammer 2. Dark Elves, similar sort of situation. Put them as moderately tough. They're usually stuck in their own starting area problems. Nagarond, Malekith, he's stuck fighting Valkyr in perpetuity. He usually doesn't expand out of control, doesn't confederate the other Legendary Lords. Rakarth is all the way in Lustria, and I never see him really expand too much. Lockyer Felhar probably has maybe the most amount of threat in Cathay, but that being said, I don't really ever see him snowball out of control. He never unites with the other Dark Elves, and I think that's one of the big things with these as well. These guys in Warhammer 2, they would unite their faction very early on and become a powerhouse, and that just doesn't happen in Warhammer 3. And because they have other enemies, they just don't really get their shit together, and so they kind of just, they'll put up a fight if you go near them, but outside of that, they're only really a challenge if you start near them. And the factions that do start near them, it's not that tough. Maybe Grombrindal's campaign early on is fairly tough, but I didn't find it that tough. But anyway, so I'm gonna put him moderately tough there. Alright, then we've got the Skaven. Skaven go under extremely dangerous. This is a race that you either want to avoid fighting, or you want to get rid of them straight away as soon as you go to war with them. This is not a race that you want to get big and powerful, and a race that you want to underestimate. Do not, under any circumstance, force march near Skaven, okay? These guys here will almost 100% ambush you all the time, and if you've got artillery and lots of missile units in your army, they will just cripple you. This is a faction that can take huge amounts of losses and just shrug them off like it's nothing. Their corruption's a huge pain in the ass. Their Legendary Lords are quite powerful. This is a faction that is very annoying to deal with. And if you don't deal with them cautiously, they can be extremely dangerous. So yeah, they're going up as top tier there, especially when controlled by the AI. They're actually quite powerful. Then we've got the Lizardmen. I actually put Lizardmen as dangerous. This is these are factions that start fairly close to one another, at least having like another Lizardman nearby, except for Nakai. So I sort of exclude him from this one. Nakai can be a bit of a challenge. But yeah, if you think of it in terms of Oxyotl is like on steroids. So if you're playing as Cinch, he's a huge threat, and meets up with Tlaqua and the Last Defenders very early on, and they become quite friendly. If you play as Tehenowin, you've got Itza and Mazdamundi fairly close by, and they become quite tight. So basically, the Lizardmen have like a fairly tight-knit group of friends that make them quite strong. Their armies are also quite difficult to deal with. But one thing about the Lizardmen is that they tend not to throw lots of armies at you, unless, of course, there's lots of factions fighting you. Then it can be a problem. Typically speaking, try to take these guys out one at a time and just pray that they don't summon a Rite of Primeval Glory in the early stages of the campaign, because that can really derail you. Don't think they're worthy of being extremely dangerous, because they're not like a tricky faction to deal with. The thing is with Lizardmen is that they're just straight up strong. Okay, pretty one-dimensional. You just got to overcome their extreme stat buffs. Okay, then we've got the Tomb Kings here. Tomb Kings I'm going to put as weak, or maybe even no challenge at all. And that's simply because the Tomb Kings, typically speaking, don't pick a fight with you. It's not that this faction is weak, it's this faction doesn't threaten the player that much, unless you're specifically playing a faction that is geared to fight them early on. So for example, if you're playing as Rapance or Manfred or Arkan the Black, for example, you're going to be dealing with Tomb Kings early on. But even then, I don't think it's that much of a challenge for you. It's quite easy to deal with. And if you're playing as literally anyone else, these guys will not pick a fight with you unless you really screw them over. And even if they do pick a fight with you, they just don't snowball out of control. So kind of no challenge with them. Okay, then we've got the Vampire Coast over here. These guys here, I'd probably put them as moderately tough. The fact that they can now revive their dead units after the battle does make them a little bit more of a challenge, more difficult to sort of get rid of them after just one battle. The vampiric corruption spreads quite quickly. They could be a big nuisance. Their armies can range from being incredibly weak to being incredibly tough. But one thing to note with them is that currently the bloated corpses do explode as soon as battles begin. Or is that just for the player? I'm not entirely sure. But yeah, I'd say that they're sort of just moderate in terms of threat. And really just determined on whether or not you start close to them and how annoying it is crossing over sea with their presence. But they're not neither super strong nor no challenge whatsoever. Okay, then we've got Reichland over here. Not specifically Reichland, the Empire. So this one is a race that sort of varies a bit depending on which faction you're going up against, because they're present in multiple locations. I'd say in the actual Empire, they're kind of weak, so that being Reichland and Balthazar Gelt. But the other two, Marcus Wolfheart and Volkmar the Grim, their location gives them a little bit more flexibility. Now, typically speaking, Volkmar the Grim, every faction that I've played so far, has typically, I've been able to take him out very easily. But I'm going to put them as moderately tough due to the potential for them to snowball in the later stages of the campaign. But yeah, if you take them out quite early, which, if you know, depending on where you start as, they're not that tough, but they can get a bunch of alliances going and be tough diplomatically to deal with. But their armies are... they range from being weak to quite strong. Not super strong. It varies a lot depending on what happens in your campaign. So I think moderately tough is a good place for them. Then we've got the Dwarfs. Now again, I want to point out that I'm not counting Endgame Crisis for this, because the Endgame Crisis for the Dwarfs is the only time I would consider the Dwarfs actually a challenge. Outside of that, I'd put them under no challenge whatsoever. Now, this is a bit of a, this will be contentious because, you know, I'm going in the book for that one. Typical sort of thing, because, well, the thing is with the Dwarves is that every time I've gone up against them, I've absolutely dumped it all over them. They're a very easy race to get rid of because they're a very one-dimensional race. They only have slow infantry units. Sometimes they'll get some gyrocopters, but they're rare-ish and not that much of a threat. Depending on who I'm playing, usually speedy, just outmaneuvering them, ambushing them. They're just not good at handling it. They're terrible at defending walled cities, just due to the AI just being so bad, not defending their victory points. So very easy faction to get rid of. Now, some people will probably find the Dwarfs to be quite a bit of a challenge, but that really does come down to playstyles. For my particular playstyle, the way that I play, I personally find the Dwarfs to be no challenge whatsoever. I don't think they've ever given me any cause for concern, no matter which Dwarven faction I go up against. Another thing is that they're usually surrounded by other enemies themselves because they're quite separated. The only Dwarven faction I think that ever really gives me some cause for concern is Thorek Ironbrow. That's kind of a minor exception, and typically speaking, just don't go into melee with Thorek. Defeat his army and ignore him, and you should be fine. Okay, Greenskins. I'm going to put that under dangerous, specifically because of wars. So when a war is not active, that's the best time to fight them. When a war is active, that's the best time to go into ambush stance and lightning strike the hell out of them, because those additional armies come in hard and fast, and they can be a real pain in the ass. Every single Greenskin faction has the power to potentially snowball out of control. They also have the power to unite the other Greenskins. They will routinely go to war with them as well and unite. So this is a faction that can confederate out of control. There's a lot of Greenskin factions all over the place. Some of their units are extremely dangerous. So this is a faction that you should be very careful about dealing with. Either take them out really early when they've just got Orc Boys and Goblins, or throw everything that you've got at them to take them out quickly when they start getting really good units like Black Orcs and Arachnarok Spiders, and I'm not going to say giants. What's it called? Rogue Idols. So very dangerous faction depending on when they pop down their wars. Okay, then we've got the vampire accounts. So this one's kind of a weird one because these guys aren't necessarily tough. They're just annoying as hell. So I'm going to put them under dangerous because these guys here, if they attack you, that's the worst case scenario, because they will, after they've been defeated, all of their casualties will just be restored to them, and then they'll run off, and then they'll be at full strength the next turn. So it's highly advised when dealing with the vampire counts that you always be the attacker. Hopefully you catch them inside of a settlement, that way they get no chance to revive any of their troops, or catch them in force march stance. That's really the best case scenario. Even like ambushing them isn't really that great of an idea because they're not that susceptible to it. And if it's during their turn they get ambushed, you beat them, they crumble, and then they just revive like 50% of their troops and then just bloody attack you again. So an extremely irritating faction to deal with. I really hope they tone down that reviving of all their units. It's very frustrating. The spreading of their corruption can also be quite a pain to deal with, depending on what kind of corruption you have. If you've got another type of corruption, then it can be difficult to get rid of it. But if you're playing as Untainted, getting rid of it's not too difficult. But overall, a dangerous race to deal with, so you just got to be careful. Then we've got Bretonnia. I would put Bretonnia under dangerous. All the Bretonians start pretty close to each other, so they're a fairly friendly race. Although I do find Lewin Leoncoeur picking fights with his own race a fair bit. So that's a bit weird. But he will oftentimes unite the other Bretonians. They do confederate other legendary lords. I have seen it happen. And their late game armies are extremely difficult to deal with. Very strong faction under the AI's control. And they will build a lot of armies. So this is a faction that you really want to take out early. Or maybe just don't piss them off in the late campaign unless you're really ready for them. But otherwise a dangerous faction. Then we've got Wood Elves over here. Another one that I would consider pretty damn dangerous, because invading their home territory can be an absolute pain. All of the forests are so irritating to invade, especially Athlorn, and their every stage of the game armies are a pain in the ass. They're very strong on the battlefield. Now, this is not a faction that will typically control the entire map, but they will put up a fight. And one of the annoying things about them as well is that the isolationist trait means nothing. You'll routinely see Durthu leaving the forest on turn 10 and making mincemeat out of the Bretonians and Greenskins in the area, and what's his name, Talson going down south into towards Maragliano. Yeah, so these are not isolationist factions, so you should be wary of them. Then we've got the Beastmen. Now, the Beastmen are a very powerful faction if controlled by the player, but when controlled by the AI, they tend not to do very much, so I'm actually going to put them as weak. You'll very rarely see them with any more than one Herdstone. They're kind of weak in auto-resolve. They're weak allies. They're just not that much. Like, they might beat you in battle, but they're not going to wipe you out on the campaign map. Like, the only one that I can consider to be that much of a pain is Kazrak, and just because Reichland has a lot to deal with and he gets to go up against him pretty much straight away. That's the only real case. Oh, and Morgur. Morgur can be a pain if you're fairly close to him. So if you're playing as Carcassonne, or if you want to fight him as Ikitclaw. The other ones, even Taurox, I don't really consider them to be that much of a threat. So they don't typically get very strong when controlled by the AI. But as the player, it's a very strong faction. Alright, then we've got Norsca. Now, Norsca's another one that, when controlled by the player, can be very powerful in Warhammer 3. A lot of things just work to their favor. But when the AI is in command of them, they just don't really do that much. So I'm going to put them as moderately tough. Because they will build, a fair few armies, and their areas are kind of difficult to conquer, and they can occupy anywhere now. And there's a lot of different Norscan factions, and they can be protected by Warriors of Chaos factions. So there's a lot of reasons to be concerned about them, but they tend not to be, your campaign destroyers. And then we've got the Warriors of Chaos, which I would put under dangerous, where their armies are their biggest concern, and the fact that they can occupy everywhere, and they tend to occupy settlements that can be very difficult to reach just because they're in the northern Chaos Wastes. And there's now a lot of Warriors of Chaos factions, and so you could end up fighting more than one of them at a time, and that can be a bit of a headache. I definitely wouldn't consider them as extremely dangerous, because I think what qualifies these guys here for extremely dangerous is their ability to be a nuisance, like the faction abilities to halt you, the ambush attack, which of course these guys here can do. It's just not seemingly as much of a threat as what the Skaven can do. So there we go. That's the tier list there in terms of how much of a threat each race is when controlled by the AI. We didn't do one of these tier lists for Warhammer 2. Hopefully you guys enjoyed that. Let me know in the comments below whether you agree or disagree. I definitely don't expect everyone to just agree with this, because depending on your play styles and the difficulties that you play on, you're probably going to have very different experiences to what I've had. But this is my experience. These are the races that I really don't like going up against, and these are the races that I just don't care if they declare war on me whatsoever. I don't ever break a sweat fighting them. And everyone in between, I have my ups and downs when finding them. Anyway, that's the end of this one. Don't forget to check out Manscaped. Link in the description and the pinned comment. Appreciate you guys, and we'll see you next time.